You wake up before your alarm goes off. It's still dark outside, and for a brief moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, there's nothing. No weight, no noise, just you and the silence of early morning. And then it hits. Not any specific thought, not at first, just a feeling. A low, familiar pressure somewhere behind your chest, like something unfinished pressing against the inside of your ribs. You haven't even checked your phone yet. You haven't read the news, you haven't seen anyone, you haven't spoken a single word, and yet your mind is already at war with itself. This is where most people's mental health conversations begin and end, in the symptoms, the anxiety, the overthinking, the burnout, the numbness. We've become very good at naming what's wrong with us. We have apps for it, we have therapy for it, we have podcasts about it, we have medication for it when necessary, and all of those things have their place. But somewhere in the process of identifying the problem, we forgot to ask a much older, much deeper question. What if the way you think about your own mind is the root of the problem in the first place? That's the question the Stoics were asking over 2,000 years ago. And the uncomfortable, fascinating, life-altering answer they came up with is still waiting for you. Stoicism was born in Athens around 300 BCE, founded by a man named Zeno of Citium, who survived a shipwreck and, having lost everything material he owned, wandered into a bookshop, read about Socrates, and decided that was the life he wanted, a life governed not by fortune, but by reason. He started teaching in a painted porch, a stoa poikile, and the philosophy that emerged from those conversations became one of the most resilient intellectual traditions in human history. It survived empires, wars, the collapse of civilizations, and centuries of academic neglect, only to resurface now, in the 21st century, at a moment when mental health is the most discussed and least understood topic of our time. That is not a coincidence. That is a diagnosis. You see, the Stoics weren't primarily interested in metaphysics or abstract logic puzzles. They were obsessed with one practical, urgent, deeply human question. How do I live well, despite everything that can go wrong? How do I maintain my peace when the world is chaotic? How do I stay clear when everything around me is designed to make me reactive, fearful, and distracted? These are your questions too. You just didn't know they were ancient. The first thing you need to understand, and this is the foundation of everything else, is the dichotomy of control. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most influential philosophers of his era, opens his entire handbook, the Enchiridion, with a single distinction that sounds almost insultingly simple when you first hear it. Some things are in our control, and some things are not. That's it. That's the beginning. But sit with it for a moment, because what he's actually saying is that most of the suffering you carry today, most of the anxiety, the resentment, the disappointment, comes from collapsing this distinction. It comes from treating things that are not in your control as if they were, and exhausting yourself trying to manage a world that was never yours to manage. Think about what you actually tried to control this week. The outcome of a conversation, whether someone liked your work, what people thought of you, how a situation at work resolved itself, whether the plan you made came together the way you imagined it. None of those things were ever fully in your control, and yet you spent enormous emotional energy on each one of them, didn't you? You replayed conversations, you second-guessed your decisions, you catastrophized outcomes that hadn't happened yet, and grieved results that couldn't be undone. And at the end of all that mental labor, the world remained exactly as indifferent to your anxiety as it always was. Epictetus would look at you with neither judgment nor pity. He'd simply say, "You confused the territory. You thought you were working on yourself when you were actually just worrying about everything else." And worry, real, chronic, persistent worry, is what happens when you take the unlimited turbulence of external events and try to process it through the finite machinery of your nervous system. The system crashes. It was always going to crash. What Stoicism offers as the alternative isn't detachment in the cold, emotionless way that word sometimes implies. This is a misunderstanding of the philosophy that has followed it for centuries. The Stoics were not trying to make you into a robot. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man on earth in his time, wrote in his private journals about grief, about exhaustion, about the difficulty of being surrounded by people who disappointed him, about the fear of death, about loneliness. He was not unfeeling. He was someone who had learned to feel without being destroyed by what he felt. That is a profoundly different thing. What the Stoics were building was not indifference, but what they called apatheia, a freedom from irrational passions. Not the absence of emotion, but the absence of being enslaved by emotion. You are allowed to feel sadness. You are not required to let sadness make your decisions for you. You are allowed to feel anger. You are not required to act from anger and then spend the rest of the week managing the wreckage. You are allowed to feel fear. You are not required to reorganize your entire life around avoiding the thing you fear. This distinction between feeling and being ruled by feeling is where Stoicism and modern psychology finally shake hands. The most effective psychological interventions of the last 50 years, from cognitive behavioral therapy to acceptance and commitment therapy, are built on a remarkably similar premise. It is not the event that disturbs you, but your interpretation of the event. That sentence comes from Epictetus, almost verbatim. The CBT therapist who asks you to examine your automatic thoughts and question whether they reflect reality is doing, in clinical form, exactly what Marcus Aurelius was doing every morning in his private journal when he wrote things like, "You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The Stoics called this practice prosoche, attention. Continuous, deliberate, non-judgmental attention to your own inner life. Not navel-gazing, not self-obsession, but the kind of disciplined self-awareness that lets you catch a destructive thought before it becomes a destructive mood, and a destructive mood before it becomes a destructive action. You've had moments of this, everyone has. That split second where you noticed yourself about to say something you'd regret and pulled back. Or the moment where you recognized that your irritability wasn't really about the person in front of you, it was about the 3 hours of sleep you got the night before. Those moments of recognition are prosoche. The Stoics wanted you to live there, not occasionally, constantly. Now here's where it gets difficult, because Stoicism doesn't let you off easily. One of the practices Seneca returned to again and again in his letters was what he called meditatio malorum, the meditation on future adversity, the deliberate, sober contemplation of things that could go wrong, not as a form of pessimism, not as catastrophizing, but as a form of psychological preparation. If you imagine losing something you love, not in a morbid, obsessive way, but honestly, clearly, for a few quiet minutes, you begin to relate to that thing differently while you still have it. You stop taking it for granted. You stop treating its continued presence as a guarantee. And if the loss ever does come, you're not meeting it for the first time in a state of shock. You've already done some of the work. This practice is wildly countercultural in an era obsessed with positive thinking. The modern mental health conversation often tells you to focus on what you want, to visualize success, to protect your peace by avoiding difficult thoughts. Seneca would find that not just naive, but actively dangerous. Not because suffering is good, but because the refusal to look at suffering, the insistence on keeping the difficult thoughts outside the door, is precisely what makes you fragile. The thing you haven't faced becomes the thing that undoes you. The Stoic path is not comfort, it is resilience. And resilience is only built through honest contact with difficulty, not around it. But here is what makes all of this bearable, even beautiful. The Stoics believed, and this is perhaps their most radical claim, that your capacity to reason, to reflect, to choose your response to any situation is something that cannot be taken from you, not by illness, not by loss, not by poverty or humiliation or failure, not by anyone who has ever made you feel small. Epictetus was a slave. He had no physical freedom, no property, no rights recognized by law. And yet he taught, and his students wrote down every word, that there is a part of you that remains sovereign no matter what happens to your body, your reputation, or your circumstances. He called it your hegemonicon, your ruling faculty. your capacity to think clearly and choose wisely. That is yours. It was always yours. You think about the last time something external, a criticism, a setback, a change of plans, completely derailed your day. Not because it was catastrophic in any objective sense, but because your mind attached itself to it and wouldn't let go. The Stoics would say that in that moment, you loaned out your hegemonicon. You handed your ruling faculty to an external event and said, "Here, you decide how I feel today." And the event, being an event and not a person with your interests at heart, spent it carelessly. Getting it back is the work, not once, every day. Marcus Aurelius did not become a Stoic and then wake up enlightened. He struggled. He wrote the same lessons down over and over again in his meditations because he needed to hear them over and over again. He reminded himself daily that other people's bad behavior said nothing about his worth, that the day was short and should be used well, that what looked like an obstacle was almost always a doorway, if you were willing to stop fighting the door and start asking what was on the other side. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was practicing, imperfectly, every single day. That is not a contradiction. That is the point. You are not being asked to become immune to pain. You are not being asked to pretend that difficulty is easy or that loss is nothing. You are being asked to examine, with honesty and with patience, the narratives you build around what happens to you. Because it is always in the narrative, never in the event itself, where your suffering lives. The event passes. The story you tell about it can last a lifetime. The Stoic tradition asks you to become, slowly and imperfectly, and with enormous compassion toward yourself, the author of that story rather than its victim. It asks you to sit with discomfort long enough to understand it, to meet anxiety with curiosity rather than panic, to recognize that the mind, left unexamined, will always default to its most fearful interpretation, and that you have the capacity, because you are a reasoning creature, to offer it a different one. This is what 2,000 years of Stoic philosophy ultimately comes down to when you hold it up against your own life. Not a set of rules, not a rigid code of emotional suppression, but a daily, humble, courageous practice of paying attention to what is actually happening inside you, and choosing, one response at a time, who you want to be in the face of it. The noise will always be there. The pressure behind your chest will come back. The world will continue being uncertain and complicated and occasionally brutal. None of that is going away. But you are not required to be at its mercy. That has always been the whole point.